Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Tresca. I am your host and the committee chair for the CAR-PGA. Oh, you know what? It helps if I pin myself. Here we go. And we have a lot today to touch on. I'm very excited to speak to our guest. I actually am excited to see we have quite a few members joining because it's during the day, I imagine. So some of that's helping. I'm doing better than last time where we had a guest from Europe and it ended up being 2 in the morning for that person. So I'm glad that we've pivoted enough to make sure we do this correctly. We are going to get to our interview topic in a moment, but I wanted to first go over some CAR-PGA business. The first thing I wanted to mention is that we are continuing to scan in newsletters, which we're very excited about. We have not done that in the past. As I mentioned last month, we have found some older newsletters back in the 90s, and we are scanning them in, transcribing them, and putting them up in date order on our CAR-PGA platform. So what that means is we just we backdate them. And therefore you'll be able to find them pretty easily. So I thought I would let everybody know that because I think that's a big deal. And it is something that we hope to continue to do more of. Certainly as we go, we're hoping to have a full collection. This has always been our goal, was to scan a lot of that content in, and we're going to keep at it, even if it's one a month. We did get another one. So, and thank you to our members who share that. Also, we've fallen behind. I thought we were doing a pretty good job. And I see, because it also crosses with our guest, I guess we haven't been updating it. So I will tell you, we have 4 members since the last time we updated it, and this is over several months. And that includes Matthew Doherty, Stephen DeShiel, Brandon O'Brien, and Professor Ian Turner, who we're going to talk to in a moment. So welcome to all of you. We will get you in our newsletter lineup, which would be good since you are members now. So we're happy to do that. And speaking of that, now I'll do the pin correctly. If I can find my add pin, there we go. Hello, Ian. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. And I'm glad it's not 2 o'clock in the morning here. Yeah.
Don't let me do that. Do not let
Yeah.
me. I mean, if I were you, I wouldn't have agreed to it. So I appreciate you didn't. But yeah, I pride myself in working with global teams. My team is global, so it was quite the screw up. But sometimes I don't realize where people are, so I've learned to ask before I go ahead and schedule a thing. And if you don't say anything, so I've apologized up and down for screwing that up. But we this is during the day, my time, so this is in the afternoon. So we figured we'd start well, first of all, thank you for coming on to the show. We're excited to have you. This is, as we'll discover, you actually have a lot of overlap with the CAR-PGA, and that's why you're a member as well. So we always start sort of broadly and then zoom them in closer to things that you're working on specifically. But I'd love to just start with, if you could walk us through a little bit about what you do, how you ended up integrating game-based learning, and sort of how you take us through your journey.
Yep, sure. Great. And thank you very much for the invite. It's great to speak to you. Just a background, I work in higher education, a university in the UK, and my background is bioscience. I'm a biologist. And I've been teaching an enormous amount of time, well, it feels like that anyway, 18 and a half years. So I've seen several technology revolutions in there. Um, uh, I guess, I've always been a gamer. In fact, people would probably call me a stereotypical geek in terms of my engagement with games, which is probably no surprise to you, given that we're here today. And I've always played games since I was young. I mean, I still recall fondly the Red Box D&D starter set, fighting fantasy books, and all those kind of things. And I guess when I became a young adult, playing those kind of games wasn't socially cool. So I kind of buried that kind of latent love for games. And I rediscovered it as an adult and started playing them again. Meanwhile, in my professional world, I've been teaching bioscience students using all the traditional measures that you would expect. And I think the catalyst for me was when a new young lecturer came, Dr. Louise Robinson, and she created a board game to teach a scientific concept, which I'm happy to talk about in a minute. And for me, that was like, oh my goodness, the thing that I love and spend all my social time interacting with can be incorporated into my day job. And that was really the catalyst for me that, you know, of showing the potential of game-based learning. So from that early venture, I went both backwards and forwards in a way. Backwards, reading about game-based learning and thinking about its place in, education from the very grassroots of primary school all the way up to secondary school, and then starting developing my own kind of games and those kind of things that I can incorporate in my teaching. So that's my whistle stop version of my career path.
That's awesome.
Mm,
And you're certainly not the first to. I always say, gamification, which became the gamification, sort of not in vogue now, but really trying to bring elements of gaming into teaching and seeing, of course, by the way, when people have fun,
mm.
they engage better. So what was that bridge for you? I mean, you said you sort of saw that together. How did that manifest in terms of bringing the two together for you? What was the way you implemented it?
Yeah, so it was a module in an undergraduate program, biology program, and it's one of those awkward teaching sessions. You can probably recall back yourself to the Friday afternoon of the last day of the term kind of session where energies levels are low, and what you're trying to do is kind of recap the key messages to take forward. So I think I've set the mood quite appropriately. Engagement's low. And my colleague created a board game to replace that recap of content, a revision game. The game's called Park Life. We've actually made it now and evaluated. I mean, in the first version, we actually made it on the backs of cornflake boxes, with cardboard counters. Um, um, and what was amazing about the game, and is amazing about every game I've played since, is how immersed people become in fictitious counters, cards, boards, um, above and beyond what could be expected in a normal teaching session. The first time I saw this game played, the session was like an hour and the game hadn't finished. And almost all the class, without even asking, carried on playing beyond the teaching session. And that's an educator's dream. Students who want to learn more and spend more time than the allocated classroom time. We also learned some really valuable lessons which stick with me today. Probably the most important one is that the learning happens above the game rather than in the game. So, when we design games now, sometimes people try too hard to put all of the stuff on the board or cards or in the things, but actually the dialogue, the communication, the talking part is where all the learning really happens. The game is kind of making a little scaffold for it around it. So that game, Park Life, we made several hundred copies of it, and then because we're academics, we formally evaluated it and wrote it up. And it was great success. Just a final point on that, which was really interesting, is that the students were very, very tolerant of a poor quality analog product. I think in the digital world, students are very intolerant of something that doesn't look flashy. But I think in the analog world, they're much more tolerant of the kind of cardboard box cutouts before we could make this professionally. So that was quite interesting as well.
Yeah, you make a really interesting point, which is role playing and tabletop role playing as a framework is by its nature sort of messy. I always say, if you especially look at Dungeons and Dragons, and we almost pride ourselves in the size of these books. Look at this, 300 pages, and for people who are not familiar with that kind of gaming, that's imagine if your Monopoly manual was that big. I
Yeah.
mean, just the thought, right? Imagine if, and certainly for those folks, which there is a mindset of like, oh my God, I have to read all this stuff. Um, what is essentially dictionaries sized manuals. So it's fascinating because it is certainly you realize you don't read it cover to cover. That's one thing, but it is this sort of old school, you know, uh data rich tool that you can feel that's different from to your point where it's digital and the idea is to conceal that, right? Hopefully it's all happening, but you don't see it. So I always find that fascinating. My brother is a game developer, and one of the first questions I always ask about his video game development is very much that, like, what's the rules behind the system? And a lot of times that's comes later, actually, which I always find, they're much more concerned about the graphics, right? And then it comes later. So it's always fascinating to see that. Um, so it obviously it worked. I mean, so I imagine you were like sold.
Mhm.
Um, And
Mhm.
so, how did you take that forward, right? So you said, as you mentioned, you sort of integrated it, and it sounded like you started writing papers and looking at this. Was that a progression, a leap, or what was the connective tissue between doing that in the classroom and then seeing how you could talk more about it in the context of both academia and mental health and some other ways in higher education?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a catalyst. So I mean, it's a symptom of my job that we need to evaluate things and write them up. But there was also a desire to show people that games have potential in higher education. And I'm not sure what it's like where you are, but certainly, yeah, any form of game is intrinsic to the primary or kindergarten curriculum. I mean, the whole thing is based on play, playful learning, and structure. I never forget my daughter coming home one day when she was probably about 4 or 5. I said, "What did you do today? What did you learn?" She's like, "Nothing." Of course, what do you mean you learned nothing? She said, "Oh, no, we were playing Roman courts." And you were learning, you were doing role play. You learned
Right.
about Roman courts. And as you move through the schooling system, certainly in the UK, particularly into the area when you get the compulsory qualifications, the idea of playfulness just erodes, and we have to be serious. And at higher education, that serious is even more pronounced. The kind of archetype of the didactic lecture. But it's nonsense because you look at any social survey, um, and top of the list for almost any age group, irrespective of demographic, games or play comes up pretty high in some capacity. So I was really empowered to use that in my teaching. So we went off in loads of directions, but very quickly I settled on role-playing games. I mean, I've always loved role-playing games, and I was just drawn by the potential of them. And I think the reason we kind of connected is through a couple of papers I did on role-playing games. So I don't know if you'd like me to talk about one of those now.
I would love to hear that. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, a real game changer for me was probably COVID pandemic, in terms of games. I mean, games became for many a way of escaping, whatever situation they faced themselves in, escaping reality. I mean, let's acknowledge, of course, Stranger Things and The Big Bang Theory, which made role-playing games a little bit more cool or sexy again as well. So, me and a couple of colleagues, saw all the literature being talked about the impacts that COVID had had on mental health and affecting people's lifestyle changes. And there's loads of literature that talks about, increases in depression and anxiety. I think in the UK it was 20% increase reported, increasing levels of substance abuse. Um, and some pretty alarming studies about how people coping. In the early pandemic, almost 3/4 of the population was saying that they're able to cope. That dropped to 2/3 within a
Oh,
few months as the pandemic increased. And that's not talking about post-pandemic sort of challenges. So, in contra to that, 50 million people allegedly play, role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, and you look at some of the numbers, like Dungeons and Dragons Beyond saw a doubling of its subscribers in the COVID pandemic, and all the online platforms that offered this. We just saw the potential. We're also really concerned about some of the kind of stereotypes that exist around role-playing games. Its historical link between delinquency and immorality, which still persists at times. I think we alluded to that in our pre-chat. Yeah, and of course, we know there's no link between D&D and psychopathology. In
mhm.
fact, research shows that D&D players specifically have higher levels of extroversion and openness to new experiences compared to non-players in a control study. So we kind of wrote, I guess, a prompt paper, to say, look, this is an untapped area in the world of mental health in a therapeutic setting. And we asked a load of challenging questions. Like, can role-playing games help people meet real-world needs through kind of symbolic in-game interactions? Could it reduce anxiety? Could it even be used to help navigate past trauma? In a clear sense. Can it increase sense of belonging? Can it build relationships? I'm particularly interested in skills development, and I'll talk about some other work in a minute if we get a chance. Um, could it be used to increase empathy, due to psychosocial development? And then there's all the anecdotal stuff. There's loads of news articles out there, helping children who've got suffer from anxiety, helping people with
Mhm.
mental health disorders, etc., etc. So we wrote this prompt paper, and the moment it was published online, we started getting queries and interactions with people, including some people who are on the call I can see today, who also had those similar thoughts, and the paper was a catalyst. Um, and from that, we formed a network.
Excellent. And that network is called.
Dungeons and Dragons in higher education. And I can tell you, when I told my boss that I was creating this network, there was more than one raised eyebrow upon his face. So we created this network because we just. I'll be honest with you, it was a bit of a vanity project when it's first created. We thought there would be 4 or 5 academics, particularly across the UK, who play D&D and also were interested in doing some research on it. So we decided to sort of create an event, which we did, and we asked for calls for talks. And I think the first event ended up with 50 people attending with some excellent talks. The talks tend to kind of range in 3 kind of areas. A big area is certainly the therapeutic potential of role-playing games. The second one is around, I'll just broadly call it skills development, but anything from social skills to the more employability skills, literacy, and all those kind of things. And then the last one is kind of in context, like using role-playing games to teach history, exactly like my daughter did at primary school. So the network was formed, we created a website, and then we've had a second and a third event. And in the third event, we had over 200 people on our mailing list, and we've actually partnered up with a big charity in the UK called Game Therapy UK, which I think their name is probably quite self-explanatory, who are very interested. Well, they provide therapeutic solutions through role-playing games, but interested in underpinning that with academic research. So we hooked up for our last event, and we've got some cunning plans for the future.
It's fantastic. And not surprising, there's an interest. This is one of those things that, we've certainly, if you watched any of the videos before, we've had a population, both from the student side and the educator side, that knows this is of value. But it seems like we have difficulty getting it implemented. It's funny, we talk about tabletop gaming, and sort of one of the ways gaming flourished originally was there were 2 factors, right? One of them is time. You have to have a group that has the time to play. Tabletop games can be short. They can be an hour, as you mentioned. But generally speaking, it takes longer, certainly even starting up. So we say like 4 hours, maybe the sweet spot. Certainly people could do it all day. And then really focus, right? Everybody has to be focused and sitting in a room. And so there are certain points in your life when those things come together, right? And mobility is one of them. So in other words, if you can't go anywhere, this is perfect for you because you don't have a lot of other options. And so high school, those 4 years are prime role playing game time back in the 80s, 90s when I grew up. The other one obviously was college. Same thing, right? So stuck university, no resources. By the way, not a resource rich game. You don't have to spend a lot of money. And then you and your mates sort of play a game. So you have 2 sections that were 4 years old each, 4 year blocks of time. But as you get older, there are other ones. And now, of course, as Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role playing games have expanded, they started to get into new worlds. So one of those places happens to be prison. So incarceration is absolutely one. Same concept, a lot of time, people who can't go anywhere, limited resources to do other things. Military bases have proven out to be another one where you have long stretches of time with folks together. And not surprisingly, classrooms where it's structured. You hopefully aren't looking at your phone. So if a professor is leading or otherwise instructing. So it's interesting how we found many more of these similar situations. And I imagine COVID recreated that, right? So in a lot of ways, COVID sort of thrust upon people a few things. You couldn't go anywhere in theory, and you were in a place with other people. Now, not everybody played together face to face. They probably played online, but the idea was we still had the raw elements that make tabletop gaming really an appealing alternative. And certainly, it sounds like from your research and in the paper, you saw a lot of those things because in some ways it's allowing you mentally to travel and experience when you can't, right? I mean, part of the appeal of at least Dungeons and Dragons is the power fantasy of being able to do a lot more with a body that can do more than you can do right now. I laugh because and I have an article coming out about this. I went hiking on the Appalachian Trail, which for an amateur hiker, I don't recommend. And one of the things I discovered was carrying 30 pounds of gear on my back for 3 hours up a cliff was challenging. I cannot imagine a Dungeons and Dragons character with a suit of armor and a weapon on their back. So, really fascinating where you think about like, wow, I have characters imagined in my head just doing physical things that I cannot imagine easily. Although it was great, I forever I will have that experience with me. So, and not surprisingly, it's interesting. I bring up COVID a lot. I know we'd all like to forget it and the pandemic, but it does seem like it sort of blew open several things. One of them being online play, the other being an epidemic of mental crisis, as you mentioned, where people needed coping skills, and for better or worse, I'm not saying tabletop gaming is the only solution to that, but really gave people an outlet. That hasn't gone away because those tools didn't go away, right? So it certainly opened it up to online streaming and a lot of other things. So now that we're through it now. Although I don't have COVID today. I don't have COVID today. Doesn't mean I couldn't get it. I did a test about an hour ago because I'm not feeling great. But how have things changed in your opinion since then? So you've certainly seen the surge in role playing and gaming with the pandemic. Are you seeing a trend? And certainly, we had a situation with my kids and their middle grades where the teachers were really concerned about what they called executive function, and they said basically students have lost working together, teamwork, speaking up, completely lost. Not that they're aggressive, not that they're not able to learn, but their ability to sort of go outside the boundaries of what would, I'm having a problem, teacher, can you help me, was completely lost. And of course, tabletop gaming seems like to be an opportunity to exercise executive function, but I'm curious what you've seen going through it and sort of on the other side. How has that helped or changed in the gaming space? And hopefully gaming can still be part of that conversation, but I'm curious where you see that going.
Yeah, you talked about so much there, and you're right. I mean, it's always interesting to see what else is going on in the literature. So, there's a rise in people talking about things like jigsaws, adult coloring books, more traditional board games, all things that probably we did in our youth, which people use as vehicles to help navigate the complexities of, isolation and such like. I mean, in UK higher education, the amount of students, and that's who I predominantly work with, who have some form of, I don't want to say the wrong word there, but, would probably have something like a self-diagnosis with something like anxiety or minor depression is quite high. Probably was before pandemic, but I think perhaps people are a little bit more aware of it. But I think you hit the nail on the head, really. We had a whole group of students, sort of 3 successive years, which were affected in some capacity in terms of being able to interact with their peers. And the worst group missed out on those really key years of, where you fully tackle your first qualifications and enter higher education without any kind of real interaction or practical experience in my field of science. So now suddenly we've got these group of students who are more aware of themselves than perhaps they were before. And I don't want to say the word lack because that's really unfair on them, but have different levels of some of the core skills that people need in the real workplace, like communicating with others, teamwork, problem solving, critical thinking, and those kind of things, because they haven't been given those experiences. And I think games are a fantastic way to do that. In fact, if you don't mind, Mike, I can tell you about a little Dungeons and Dragons adventure that we wrote to kind of tackle that.
Please.
So yeah, so in the UK we call it employability skills. So skills that employers want. I'm not sure if it's the same term over there, but all those things I just listed before. Um, and normally what happens is those skills are kind of embedded in the curriculum. So while we're teaching, genetics or a bioscience topic, we try and sneak in a bit of communication by making them doing an activity. It's a bit forced sometimes, but we know how important these skills are. And if you said to students, okay, we've got an extracurricular session on team working you can come to, well, no one's going to come. I would want to come. That doesn't sound interesting. So me and my colleague designed a Dungeons and Dragons adventure to develop and help people recognize their employability skills. So it was designed for people who've never played Dungeons and Dragons before. So one of the key challenges we had at the beginning is, well, how do you get someone playing Dungeons and Dragons literally off the gun? Apologies, just right from the start, without explaining rules and doing character development. I mean, that's a real challenge, and it can be a barrier, as I'm sure you can imagine. So we came up with this scenario. Literally, as soon as they walk in, more or less, I'm DM, and we tell a little story about how they were studying hard in the library. It was getting close to midnight, and one by one, they slowly drop off, and then they wake up in the adventure. So we decided that they'd play themselves rather than a fictional character. We thought that would ease the transition into playing the game. So they're still themselves, but they're trapped in this white marble clad room where they can't see the ceiling. You can imagine it. I won't go into full storyteller mode for you today. And what we set up was a series of, I guess, puzzles, traditional puzzles. Like in the first room, there's a series of levers. The number of levers corresponds to the number of players, and they have to pull the levers in the correct order in order to open the door. Now, each of the rooms has got a puzzle, and each of the puzzles was designed to test a different kind of employability skill. For example, in one room, there's a gargoyle that speaks who will open the door for them. But they have to communicate with it in the correct way in order to do so. So we had some other challenges. So to start off with, as DM, I was much more directive than I would normally be, asking each player what they would do, but gradually withdrew that as the game progressed. Obviously, like all good DMs, we're flexible. If they've spent 10 minutes and they can't work out the levers, suddenly pulling any lever will open the door, right? So, we're not restrictive in that sense. My colleague Louise, who I mentioned, she acted as a non-player character. So basically, we had a little grey imp called Itch the Imp, who would appear in a puff of smoke, call them idiots, and give them a clue if they needed, and disappear again. And it's great fun. The first time we played was really interesting. So all the people who were playing it were non-D&D players. And as we played the first room and walked through the first corridor, there was one player who clearly was much more confident and was dominating the conversation. So I did a quick dice roll, and unfortunately, this player walked through a big sticky cobweb, which kept their mouth tied for 5 minutes. So those kind of narrative hooks are really fun. So we played the game, and what we were doing as they were playing is we were giving them little. They did have a little character sheet which we didn't talk about, but they read as they're playing, and we were giving little counters as they were going through. And at the end of the game, they meet Itch the Imp again, and there's like this big invisible kind of wall which is to the real world. And he basically says, "You've got to convince me that you're worth it." And this is where they use these counters to convince him that they develop the skills through the game to go through. So in a way, the puzzles was kind of a parody of your CV or curriculum vitae or resume, and
Right.
the kind of transition through the wall was a bit of a caricature for a job interview. Like all good games, the students were dead disappointed that we had to finish in the time frame. Yeah. Which is, I view as a testament. So we run that several times. We've actually run it with 40 or 50 people. And what we did there, that was at a conference. We asked for people who played games before and gave them a quick briefing, and they became games masters, and we gave them a bit of a script. So they kind of run the game for us. I also was asked to do it online as well, which was really interesting because we had about 50 people turn up. So I had to keep rotating the people who were in the room. You know, the other people could see their friends trapped in the library, but they couldn't speak to them. But they had their mobile phones and they could text. So we used the chat box along thing to give ideas. I had to make the puzzles much harder in order to do that. But yeah, so it was a really fun experience. Like all things, we wrote it up and evaluated it and published it. So that was a cool little adventure for us.
That's fantastic. Did you formally explain to them the connection to the higher education employability, or was that sort of a subtle thing?
I'm so glad you asked that question. You know, one thing we learned about games before is the most important thing about using your gaming lessons is the pre and post elements. And
Hmm.
in this case, it was very brief. You know, the pre stuff was we didn't want to give them a chance to be uncomfortable, so we launched straight in. But post game, there was about a 5 minute talk, which just connected the dots. What you don't want is the students to go away and speak to their friends and say, "What did you do today?" I said, "That's brilliant. We did this role playing game," and da, da, da. And they say, "Why'd you do that?" And they go, "I don't know." Yeah. So what we do is we make the connected dots. We connect to the formal careers service and their signposting. You know, we're opening the door for a formal activity, and that is fundamental to making the game-based learning work.
I love it. Yeah, and this goes back to the that phrase executive function. Tabletop gaming requires executive function because nothing happens if you don't do something.
Yeah,
In a lot of ways, I think video games get you off the hook. They will. I mean, as you had the imp, which would sort of help along, but it really does get people to sort of have to not just be quiet, and as you mentioned, have somebody dominate to the point where no one else talks.
yeah,
And all of those are challenges that, unfortunately, in real life, we wish we had an imp to sort of jump in and run interference, or a clear goal so that you felt like a reward was worth the effort. And I certainly, when you're working with groups and teams, these dynamics well. It's first you've seen. I'm sure you've seen it in the classroom as well. So it's fascinating to see this because it does really, and I think the phrase for Dungeons and Dragons is anything can be attempted. And
yeah.
yeah, so that's intimidating, and quite the challenge for new players. And we have to try, as I think you did an excellent job, strike the balance between you can do whatever you want, and but don't spend all day trying to figure out do whatever you want. You need to just sort of take the leap a little bit. And it sounds like you found that perfect mix. So is that something you plan to do? Is that, and I know you have some of these sessions. This is going to be an ongoing thing, or what's the plan for how you run those in the future?
Yeah. So just a quick word on the cleverness of players. I remember one time I was running this game chat when one player decided to break off one of the levers and try and leverage the door open, and I never even considered that as an idea. So that was an instant success. Just I'm always surprised at what people
Yeah.
can come up with in effectively
Hmm.
a closed room. It's dead impressive. Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm a bit of a magpie, and I always have been. So I see a shiny thing, I pick up the shiny thing and play with it for a bit, and then I move on to the next shiny thing. So
Hmm.
that exact iteration, has been rested. By the way, anyone who wants to have a copy of the adventure, the rooms, and the maps, they're all publicly available. If anyone wants to have a play around with it. So I'm moving on to kind of new ideas now. One thing that's interesting when I speak to people about this kind of thing is they're like, some people say that's interesting, but whoa, that must have taken so much time to plan,
Right.
and there's no way I could do that. But some other work I've done uses off-the-shelf games and just turns them into an academic lesson. Um, One of my favorite examples is I did some, well, like all things, it turned into a research paper on the game. I think it's by Endemic Games, Plague Inc., which you may have heard of. It's an app-based game where you take the role of either bacteria or virus, and the idea is to, well, in the original game, kill the entire population of the Earth as quickly as possible. And this was pre-pandemic, so just,
Yeah. Not quite as funny now. Yeah, but yeah.
no, just
So
let me
what was
just
the
get that in there.
what was the game you said?
Plague Inc. Yeah,
Plaguing. Got it. Okay. Hmm.
yeah, it's an app-based game. So pre-pandemic, I'll just stress that again, we decided that in a microbiology module where we're teaching pandemics and epidemics, that we're going to use this game as a vehicle for helping teach. So in the lesson, we started off by asking students to play the game, and they can choose any starting country for their virus bacteria and any route of transmission. And we gave them, I think it was about 8 minutes to kill as many people as they could. But we asked them to document what choices they made. So, somebody was started in, Canada and was a war-borne virus, etc., etc. And then we put all these on the board, and that was a great vehicle for a discussion about effective routes of transmission. And then the second part of the lesson, we actually controlled the experiments. So we did a semi-scientific method within the game where we said, okay, we want this half of the class to start in Eastern Asia and be land-borne, and then we started to control the game to see what the effects were. And the theoretical content on epidemics and pandemics was still there, but suddenly you got this game-based framework around it, and the enjoyment level shot through the roof. People were talking more, and as always, like I said in the first example, people wanted to carry on playing post-lesson, which they did. So it was really, really powerful. So it still took some prep, but that was a ready-made game, and we're just using that as a scaffold for our teaching experience. So it was good fun.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I mean, this is sort of the thing, and I think it's funny you mentioned this. You've said it a few times. Um, how many people can say after any kind of educational session they want to keep going, right? Or even just want to do it without saying, well, oh, I have to do that, but to want to do it voluntarily is just a massive, massive success. And then not want to end, which is a teacher's dream. So
Yeah.
I think it's fantastic. And obviously you've hit on some kind of combination. So
Mm,
I mean, look, I feel like you've at least puzzled this out in
mm,
terms of the basic elements to get people engaged.
mm,
So, we've had this conversation with some educators in the US. Um, and I think everybody fundamentally gets this, but there are absolutely, for one, I always say, look, if it was actually everybody agrees it's great. They all agree tabletop role playing makes sense. They all agree it's
mm.
wonderful for education. They all agree that students love it. And then nothing happens. And I say that in the sense that I've had, and you've probably seen some of them, interviews for years where it's really almost an individual based sort of push to make that happen versus
Yeah.
an institutional change. What, in your opinion, needs to change for us to really get this to be an institutional change that is embraced as how we educate versus sort of passionate professors like yourself saying, what a great idea. And, hoping people sort of, they kind of get it, but, we're not seeing a university say this is how we're teaching going forward. What is it
Yeah.
that we need to get us to the next stage of this kind of engagement?
Oh, that's a tough question. And that is a really tough question. I mean, start off with a slightly cautious caveat that though I think games are part of the answer, they're not the full answer. And if everybody did game-based learning, it would be very boring. It's about the diversity of the learning and teaching experiences in any setting, I think. I mean, I think change comes probably in education in probably three different vehicles. One is the educators themselves, and we can get very deep in their own motivations and their own training. One part is systematic, so making sure that the institution's got a structure that allows you to do these things. But it's a very important point, and it troubles me a lot. I mean, you kindly said that I'm a professor. And you can probably tell from my picture that I'm a white male, and I have a lot of privilege in there to try out these kind of things. And we don't have the same system in America where, it's the kind of tenure system. So my risk is low from trying something which is probably in some people's sense quite out there and outlandish. So I think it's important that I recognize that here. But the most powerful vehicle always has been and always will be the students themselves. We talk about co-creation, where our curricula are designed alongside our students. So any initiative that involves students leading from the front is a key way. In fact, I was talking to two wonderful students, Vicky and Charlene, this morning, who are studying a therapeutic program, who weren't gamers, but have discovered D&D and straight away could see the potential for it in their professional practice, and have started making waves and created their own research project off their own bat, and along the way converted many more people to see the potential of TTRPGs. So yeah, I think students is the answer.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, certainly everything we've heard is that in some ways this is the way we'd like to be taught, right? So the student becomes a teacher, so to speak, and you hope generationally this begins to change as students go. You know what I would love? Certainly that was, I've engaged in a lot of simulations and business, and for me, they were absolutely the best way to engage the population, and you could see it from everybody we worked with and played with. But it is sort of this still a little bit of people have to be convinced. I certainly I think your point is valid. It's not you know the world's not going to be a gaming utopia, and if it
Yeah.
was, it wouldn't be accurate anyway, right? So some of what makes gaming so great is that it's another piece of the puzzle. I just don't feel like it's ever been as much a piece as we'd like it to be. Uh, so um,
Yeah.
so to
Yeah. I
that
mean,
point, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, no, sorry, no, I agree with you. I mean, it's interesting because when you say the word game, it's a question I often ask. What comes to mind when you think of game? But I mean, parts of games have been part of the education system for many years. I mean, if you use something like classic, like a quiz, I mean, there's not many educators that don't use a quiz in some capacity, and it meets some of the criteria for a game. Things like simulation or role play, depending on what you want to call it, have been the cornerstone of healthcare education for eons. Simulating patients with illnesses and those kind of things. So I think some of the frameworks there, but I think perhaps the notion of game through popular culture has created a different perception about what it is, particularly that link to children and playfulness and immaturity and the serious world that we live in. We need to be serious. They kind of balance uncomfortably against it in people's heads against each other.
Yeah, and I think that is sort of our challenge too, is even the framework of the phrasing we use to have these discussions. Um, Gaming is a broad term and in some ways does a disservice to it. I mean, certainly, look, we've lost tabletop gaming has lost the phrase role playing game, right?
Yeah,
So now people think that's a video game.
yeah,
And they're related, but they are not this. I mean, we just
yeah,
talked about how different they
yeah,
can be. So we've lost some of the thread on some of how we talk about this, and it almost feels like we need new phrasing
yeah.
in how we engage because tabletop gaming is different from video games and brings a lot of elements. And certainly, I think the pandemic brought that forward, which was quite interesting and illuminating in how much of a difference it makes. So, to that
Mm.
point, obviously, language is one of the pieces I think we've got to get straight. But what's your advice for sort of taking this forward for other folks, other educators? Obviously, you've got the Dungeons and Dragons in higher education. Um, it sounds like this is sort of a classroom by classroom initiative versus an institutional change, which I think we're familiar with. But what would be your advice to? We have several educators who are part
Yeah.
of our CAR-PGA membership. Would love to hear what you would recommend.
Yeah, so thank you. It's a good question. Well, I mean, I do game design workshops with some colleagues. First of all, some really simple things. Start small. So, I mean, a game can be, macro, a whole session or a whole unit or whatever, but start small. Start with something small, something that takes 10 minutes of a session, and then scale up. The chance, the risk, it decreases with the time you devote in the session to it. So start small, not that ambitious role-playing game. It's going to take 3 hours to play. That's a high risk. If you are not a gamer yourself, play games. Yeah, yeah, it's a fundamental thing. You need to play games to understand them, and you need to believe it as well. You really need to believe that this could be the answer. If you're designing a game for the first time, one trick that I've learned a lot is that you're obviously very limited in time in a game, and you've got a very diverse audience. So I often say that not everybody, but many students in the room will know some of the core games that are pervasive across many different cultures. For example, if you say this game is a bit like Battleships, or a bit like Snakes and Ladders, or a bit like Monopoly, people have already got some kind of intrinsic understanding of what they need to do. And that can save enormous time in the classroom. And when you have people who don't know what that cultural reference is, there's normally enough that outweigh it. Um, More detailed. So I've devised a list of kind of 10 things that I think every game needs. So these are adapted from Mark Rosewater, the designer for Magic the Gathering's kind of rules. And he's done a series of podcasts about them. And I talk about them a lot. If you want to make a game that is replayable, which is the ideal experience, I think all games should have 10 things. And I'll fire through them quickly. They should have goals. So what is the absolute purpose? Why on earth am I playing this? What am I trying to do? You should have rules. So what can I do and what can I not do within the framework of achieving that goal. All good games should have interaction. Not going to sit in silence, otherwise we're doing an exam. All good games should have the ability to catch up. So if the game is taking a period of time, you shouldn't halfway through that know that one person is going to win and no one else has got a chance of winning. Games shouldn't have inertia where somebody's clearly met the win condition, but you're just going through rotations of the board so they get the necessary number of counters, probably like Monopoly. All games should have surprise or chance. Some hardcore gamers may disagree with me there, but that element of not knowing what's going to happen. Good games should have strategy. So if you play it multiple different times, you learn from that. People can tackle it in different ways. Games should be fun. And if you have to tell someone that the game is fun, then I'm afraid it's not. Last two, it should have flavour and a hook. And I think this is probably the key thing for me that people often forget when I help them design games, particularly if they're non-gamers. And a great example, I did a games workshop in another university, and someone had designed this game for pharmacy students where they had a fictitious patient and they had to work out the correct treatment plan for them, and it bombed. It wasn't working at all, and I didn't change anything at all except for create a narrative. It's Sacred Heart Hospital. It's 5 minutes to midnight. The patient's just arrived and your supervisor's disappeared off to the canteen. You can't find them. They've got 5 minutes to live. What do you do? So kind of narrative. Some of the students loved it, completely made up nonsense narrative. But, the little stop clock next to them and that scenario changed the game. And of course, like all good games, that prompted the discussion which the educator wanted. What they did, if what they did was right or wrong, didn't matter. It's about why they made it in the discussion post it. So flavour and the hook. So there are 10 things I think all games need.
Fantastic. I think that's great. And that's online as well, as you mentioned.
That's some talk, but Mark Rosewater from Magic the Gathering has done podcasts on each of those. They're borrowed heavily from his inspiration.
Excellent. So, in this interest of time, we have a bunch of folks on the call. I bet they have questions for you. So, we will open that up. But before we do that, where can we find you online? Just so we have that note.
Yeah.
Where's your home base?
Yeah, so I'm based at the University of Derby in the UK, so I have a page there. And like all people, I have a Twitter handle, which is called @DocWithTheSocks, which is probably the easiest way if somebody wants to hook up with me.
Excellent. And the Dungeons and Dragons in Higher Education has a page, right?
Is that yeah, it does.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Excellent.
I will put it in the chat for people.
Excellent. Yeah. And we'll make sure we look at that. But if you can put it in the chat, that will help. So, perfect. So, we absolutely adore what you're doing. So I'm going to open this up to our folks, many who have very specific interests in this. Any questions for Professor Ian Turner from our audience? Alan posted something very interesting, which was what the reasons were while we're waiting.
Yeah.
Simon, go ahead. And Simon froze. There you go, Simon.
Sorry.
Try
Okay.
again.
Sorry, yeah. I went into the conservatory and it was quiet. I was just wondering, so you talked about how you did these things in the classroom and you analysed the data. So what kind of metrics were you taking away to actually analyse afterwards?
Oh, superb question. So it very much depends on the game itself. So I guess there's three parts to that answer. First of all, as a background, by training, I'm a quantitative scientist, being a biologist, but I've reinvigorated myself as probably more a mixed method scientist that use qualitative analysis. I'll know a side word that in a minute. The three ways we measure would probably be the traditional measures of engagement with activities, which is a very big field in its own right. The second measure would be knowledge gain, or, so attainment in whatever the learning outcome or the driver of the game was. So in the microbiology game, it was about understanding of epidemics and pandemics. And the third thing is about any kind of measure that links to kind of enjoyment, or, and those kind of aspects. So there are scales and measures which have been validated in other studies, which are proxies for those. One interesting ethical kind of dimension we always face in these kind of studies is if you think, I've got this great idea for teaching microbiology, using this game. What's your control sample? Do you do another class without having the intervention and use that as your counterpoint? Because not many people think, next year I've got this great idea I'm going to have. If you've got a great idea, you do it. And, once you've done the great idea, you don't want to go back and do it again. So that's always an interesting counterpoint. So there are some tricks you could do, like using, comparable students with all other things considered, or using students' prior experience in different topics and those kind of things.
You're muted, Simon. You're not coming through. He's good. He's like, good. You answered my question. Thank
you. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Simon, for that question. Other questions? I don't know if you saw in the chat there. There you go. Go ahead.
Hi there. I'll put my camera on. It's not so much a question as just a comment. I was really struck by something you said earlier, Ian, about play, and about how it's sort of socially acceptable for children to play. And in terms of child development, we focus so much on children's play and how that's good for kids and good for social development. And it's almost like when people hit 18 years old or 21 years old, it's like, done, no more play. The level of research into the benefits of play for adults, other than just the therapeutic benefits, there's some stuff on that, but there's staggeringly little. And I think it's a really interesting thing that we can, and we academics should be pushing forward a little bit, is why don't we look at adult play? It's clearly such an important psychosocial part of engagement with one another. Play is one of the biggest things that people do in their spare time, yet we don't, as academics, or academia as a whole, doesn't seem particularly interested in it. So I think that was a really interesting point you made. I just wanted to agree with you.
I doubly agree. I mean, it's interesting because, we do see a few things in my limited, you obviously know more about this than do, but you see things like maker spaces and those kind of things popping up in UK higher education institutes, which are kind of a recognition that the power of playing, coming up with new ideas and creating things, and which probably taps into things like kind of like creative jams and hackathons, which have got very playful elements and structures to them. Interestingly, I'm also a Lego serious play facilitator, which is a technique which is originally born from business, and it uses the Lego bricks in a structured way, certainly, but taps into playfulness to deal with complex problems, particularly allowing people to express those things which are really hard to articulate it orally or in any other form. Something like my values, or my how or something like a company vision, or those kind of things. You create it using Lego bricks, using a metaphor technique, which is very playful, and then you structure up and build those together collaboratively to create a shared vision through bricks. So yeah, that's got its place in higher education. I've enjoyed using that in a range of settings, from helping leaders come up with shared visions to helping individual students think about ways to navigate through their academic studies. The thing I love about play in that context is, I've already talked about who I am. If I've got an 18-year-old student, which is quite typical as one of my sort of tutees, me talking to them to their careers is probably the same experience my daughter has when I try and ask her about what she's done at school. They don't want to talk to me, but using a playful approach like Lego bricks, is really powerful in that it just takes away the me-ness and centers the thing on the bricks, and then we can build up from that. So I think it's really interesting.
Excellent. Yeah, and certainly we've seen this, as I said, gamification was all the rage in the business world where I live. And but then sort of flared out, partially because I think it was integrated and we don't talk about it as much, right? It wasn't quite as noteworthy. It was just assumed. But certainly every digital sort of engagement now tends to have some kind of scoring program, a point program, a lot of that stuff. It's not as fun as everybody thinks, though. I think that's the other key piece is gamifying something. You know, what you outlined in those 10 points are definitely more than make sure there's a score, make sure you can compare your score to other people. That's not the same thing we're talking about. And it's unfortunate because I think gamifying a lot of aspects has turned into more about the points and the appearance of a game than the fun of the game. And just because I can get points, by the way, you know, there's only so many things I want to have points in, incidentally. So now everything's got a point system, you know, great. Oh, okay. That's not really fun.
I've seen a great example of that in my daughter's education. So there's a platform in the UK called Timetable Rockstars, designed to help young kids with their mental arithmetic. Basic idea is, you know, a guitar riff, and the calculations pick, you type them as quickly as you can, and you get scores. And from those scores, you can spend the points to change your Rockstars look. So on face value, it's fantastic because both of my children spent in a very short period of time, learnt their times tables. But what you very quickly saw is that things like leaderboards start to form, and you already know all this, but you can quickly see that those children who weren't able to engage with the platform, accessing internet is a privilege, were near the bottom of the leaderboard, and you can see that became a demotivational tool to those kind of people.
Right.
So I quickly worked out that some people were scoring scores which are beyond the physical possibility in terms of the time frame. So I realized parents must be trying to manipulate the system. So,
oh my gosh.
So it can be a negative indicator. I mean, you know, those gamification can be a positive, neutral, or negative nudge, you know, in this case. So actually, I did write to the school, and from that, they did reset the scores every week because of that. Just, you know, give everybody a chance, which I thought was good.
Yeah, it's fascinating too, because again, because this is new territory in some cases, there are unforeseen consequences. And as we mentioned earlier, like how do you measure and what do we all agree on is success, right? So what do you agree is the success of a gamified learning experience? I worked with at one of the gamification sessions that I attended where I was a speaker. We met some of these banks that were doing gamification, and they had a lot of money, a lot of money. So they would measure your pulse rate and your pupil dilation, which is terrifying to me, but was sort of, you know, like trying to get into your brain to see if you were having a good time. And I was like, we're just missing the point, in my opinion, at that point. If my heart rate is elevated and I'm having a good time, and then call it a success. So it's always fascinating to see sort of, we don't have an agreed upon mean of measuring this. I hope the ultimate goal is education still, and not points. But it is fascinating because I think it's still very much an open sort of topic as to what's the right way to do it. And again, right way is broad, maybe the appropriate way from a menu. And then also making sure, as you mentioned, some of those gamified elements don't turn out to be demotivators because they are actually, as you said, you know, they don't have a slant one way or the other, positive or negative. They just are another way of engaging with the system. They can be used positively or negatively. So,
yeah. I mean, in my space is maybe a bit of a conclusion. I always found it deeply amusing. One of my colleagues did a study on the kind of reminder messages we sent to students out. So they did a controlled study where they sent out a neutral message. Here's a new thing for you to look at. A positive nudge. If you look at this thing, it will help you with. And a negative nudge. If you don't look at this thing, the consequences will be. And you're probably not surprised to see that the negative nudge resulted in the most downloads of the resource going forwards. So a little systematic.
Carrot and stick. They are both useful. Same thing in role-playing games. Taking damage is a great way. I often say, you know, it's funny, especially with my new players, I always say, you know, trying to get a group to play together. And I said, if you go through enough situations, you'll all be friends. And just because you'll end up saving each other multiple times. But initially, it's hard to tell someone that and then to get it, right? That, you know, you'll be dragging some other character out of the rubble. This one will be healing you at your worst time. This one's going to be trying to help you. But it just sort of happens. And it's so funny because every group unfailingly assuming they don't go their own ways for other reasons, just through tabletop play and teamwork, inevitably there's so many opportunities to sort of help each other and sort of gel. And it's there's been a couple articles and several books about this where, this kind of idea that people go to these, escape rooms, they go to for team building, and they do that because it's really just, we always say D&D light, right? So tabletop gaming light, which is we do this every time for fun, where you come out and we are better friends because we collectively were successful, and you saved my character and I saved your character and we did a great thing. And escape rooms are that very intense, condensed version of that teamwork to success. So it's always fascinating to see. And of course, as you said, and Alan pointed this out, what's the number one thing people have a challenge with? It's time. It takes too much class time and too much prep time. I think that's interesting because that seems to be really the factor. As you said, everybody wants to keep going. Well, they want to keep going probably because they feel like, well, that was good, but I could do this for 4 hours easy, right? I did the game design merit badge for the Boy Scouts for my troop, and it is an art to get it down to an hour and change, and I still don't know that I've figured it out. So it's a lot, but it's doable, and I think certainly if one kid takes that and wants to do more with it, we're on the right track.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Any other questions before we wrap? It's the game design merit badge.
Yeah.
You look it up. It has you have to pick the game. So there's 4 games that you 3 games that you pick. No, 4 games you pick, and you try them out and analyze them. And Ian, you had mentioned some of the elements of what makes a good, like you go through the components and the style and you analyze them. So of course I pick Dungeons and Dragons as the final one every time. I will give a point of advice. If you know the tumbling tower games like Jenga, don't do that with a crowd of rambunctious 20 or plus boys. Don't recommend that. I've learned that one the hard way because they will chuck that sucker across the room and be like, oops, and that's the end of your focus as they all laugh. But yes, it's quite an experience. Okay, I think that's all we have. So thank you so much for joining us. This is one of our best attended. I'm having an epiphany that we need to do these earlier in the day. So I think that's great because the attendance is off the charts comparatively. So I think we're going to keep trying with these timeframes if we can manage them. But I so appreciate you taking the time. We have your website. So it's a Google site for D&D and higher education. We have your Twitter feed. You are a member, so you're not going to get away. Absolutely. I see that, Herwood. We're going to have to try and think about this, at least for the UK members as well, which I love. I'm glad that you're all able to join. And anything we missed, anything you wanted to share, Ian? That we didn't
I think we've had a great discussion. Like we talked for several more hours, but
easily. As always, we could.
Yeah.
Yes. No. So wonderful. Well, this is the beginning, not the end of a fantastic dialogue and hopefully collaborative teamwork, because now you're part of the family. So we absolutely will support you however we can. I think what you're doing is fantastic. I think it is. We just don't have enough of it. That's my answer to all these things. I think we all it's always a love fest when we're here together. So I'm always trying to keep, and I appreciate Dr. Alan White's graphic there, because we do have to really, yes, we all get it, but it's not happening. And there's reasons. I think those are all very good reasons to frame the discussion, but we got to keep fighting the good fight, which is wherever the students engage and they care, and particularly post-pandemic, whatever tools we can use to get people to learn and enjoy learning, the better. So thank you so much for taking the time. We will put this in our newsletter. We'll put it on YouTube, and we will certainly keep the discussion going. And you will have to come back for your next big thing, which I have no doubt you've already got something cooked up.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Don't go away. We will stop the recording and we will pick it up from there.